Humans are really hitting a tipping point of burning out. We had COVID, which created global disruption in the way we work, the way we live, the way childcare works, the way elder care works. And then after that, it's just been thing after thing, multiple global wars, a lot of upheaval within our own systems. We see so much suffering just day to day. And so I think all of it's just hitting this breaking point where people are finally admitting, I'm not doing well.
Welcome to Crazy Beautiful Truth. I'm here with Dr. Megan Shen. Megan, thank you so much for joining us. I met Megan at TEDx Bellevue Women, where you gave a really great and compelling talk about something near and dear to my heart that was about grief and all the little griefs, all the things we don't necessarily give ourselves permission to grieve, not just the loss of a person, but the loss of future memories or the loss of a job or the loss of an expectation. That really just blew my heart wide open. You did such a great job. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
How is it to have that behind you?
I think I'm still unpacking it. It was such a wonderful opportunity to be a part of the team that planned and put on the event. The other speakers, it was an amazing cohort of just phenomenal women with really important things to say. So I think to be in the room was a real honor. But I think after to get to start to hear back from people who were in the audience and where it spoke to them directly has been really exciting because you practice, you go out there, you hope that it reached some people, but to actually hear that it connected, it has been really powerful.
What kinds of things are you hearing from people?
Yeah, it's so interesting. The talk was about all the little griefs we have. So the things that maybe are outside of a traditional loss of a person. And so I was struck by how many people came to me and said, my last kid just left home and I have been feeling so down and I didn't know what was going on. And you put a name to what I was feeling, that was grief, and kind of gave them space to breathe. I think that's been the thing I've been hearing a lot is there's almost a relief of like, oh, this is a real thing that I'm experiencing. I had another woman come up and share that her husband had been diagnosed with cancer and they were going through treatments. And that's actually one of the threads that I tie through my talk because my work is with cancer patients. And she was like, you think a lot about the treatments and all the things you fear with cancer, but to name like all the griefs of the things they were losing as a couple, as a family, was just really powerful to hear how much that gave her, I think, a script to talk from and a place to begin processing that grief.
I hadn't thought about that, but this idea of you helping to give people language. So there are two things I'm hearing in what you describe. I hear permission to have an experience that is real and validated and doesn't need justifying, because I think for anyone else who is like me, I can be like, but it's fine. And we justify, and if we can't come up with the story to match the internal disruption, we tend to dismiss it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Do you see that too? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then the parallel to that, then having the gift of language and a shared vernacular to begin to talk about it and bring people into the experience. And then this is where I get this beautiful picture in my mind of Dr. Megan Shen dropping a pebble in a pond and all these ripples spreading out as all these people, it was mostly women in the room, have language and begin to give permission to one another as we talk more and more about grief.
Yeah. It's interesting because part of what they train you to do in giving a TED talk, because it's so nerve-wracking, is they're like, focus less on it being a talk and think about what is the offering you want to give to the audience. Like, what's the one central thing you want to offer to them? And I thought a lot about this talk and I was like, what is the thing I want most? And at the end of the day, what I really centered myself on is I was like, I think I want them to be seen, to feel seen and heard. In a space where maybe they hadn't thought to even put the language of grief around it. And so that was really powerful to hear. The feedback is that I think people were feeling really seen.
So good. And having been in the audience, that makes a lot of sense to me, that suddenly we feel not in the shadow,
Right.
of these things that we didn't know how to name. So you are a social psychologist. You are a PhD. You're a professor. You have taught, you research, you're an author. You've written all over the place. Why grief for you?
Mm, I think my journey professionally in grief started right around the time I was finishing my PhD and transitioning into my postdoc. Um, and I was working, it was my first time working in a healthcare setting. And so I was very new to that space at a cancer center in New York. And it struck me that there was so much going on for treatment and cure and all these things, but that nobody was really dealing with the human side of what was happening to patients and the grief that they were experiencing. And I think that's where I became really interested, is that a lot of people, when I say what I do, they're like, well, that's really a downer, that you do grief for a living. But I have completely experienced the opposite. I think some of the most life is lived where people are experiencing loss, because it's these meaningful connections and points of love that patients and their families are experiencing that's causing all the grief, both in treatment and if a patient ends up passing away from their illness. And so over time that evolved, and I started to see, like, yes, grief is death and fearing death, and in some cases, losing somebody that we love. But there's all these other losses that my patients were experiencing that were almost hitting them harder. Things like losing their fertility because of treatments, losing their ability to retire because they had to keep working for insurance coverage, or not being able to travel the way they saw. And so I think that's where I learned the scope of grief was so much bigger than I originally thought when I started this work.
So when we talk about grief, I do think, you and I talked in preparation for this call that grief is something near and dear to my heart, and is something that I really see when I'm coaching and facilitating in corporate spaces. And it seems to me there are different flavors of grief. What is grief and how do you recognize it?
Yeah, so the way I define grief is I call it the loss of an imagined future, which is that anything you're feeling really sad that you've lost and you imagined having, um, I think that's where grief enters the stage. And so, of course, at its core, grief is the loss of somebody we love. And the loss there is they're not in our lives anymore. And even though we all know we're not getting out of this life alive, right? None of us escapes death. It's still, no matter how young or how old the person you love is when they die, everyone expresses just like it was always too soon. You always wanted a future where that person was in it. And so I think that extends to some of these other forms of grief too, right? When you get a divorce, you probably didn't imagine when you said I do that that was the trajectory. When you face infertility, you're probably not imagining that when you set out on the exciting adventure of trying to conceive, right? And so for me, that's how I have come to define it over time.
And do people resonate with that when you're talking to them about it?
I think so. Like, I think that's a lot of the feedback I got for this talk and other things I've done, which is like, I never thought about grief as the loss of imagined future. Because I think we say grief is just death. And it is in some ways, right? Things are dying. But sometimes those things are people, sometimes those things are dreams, hopes. And so I think it gives some context and language for what people are experiencing.
Yeah. So one of the places I would see it is coming out of COVID. And so I'm
Mm.
curious about your perspective on this, Megan, is what would you say in a case like that? What, like if we had to point to what's the thing you're grieving in that imagined when you come through 2.5 years of total loss and disruption,
Yeah.
what's the grief there?
Yeah. I think it's so fascinating that you brought COVID up, because I think that's actually, that for me was the trigger point where my work with grief extended past working with the death of a loved one. So up until COVID, I worked very much in the cancer space. I was really around supporting patients and their families who are facing terminal illness. When COVID hit, I sort of saw that the response we have to grief when we lose someone, if you've ever lost somebody dear to you, and I know you've experienced those losses,
Yes.
it almost is such an overwhelming emotion that you kind of can't escape it at first. Like you can try, um, but in many ways, people report feeling like really forced to reckon with the fact that they are grieving the loss of somebody. Whereas with COVID, I think that models more of these other losses, like I've mentioned, where you're losing something that isn't maybe a person, but it's a form or a way of living that is just like not an option to you anymore. And COVID was the first time in my life that I had seen it on such a large scale. I mean, it was globally, we were all experiencing I think what we were experiencing was the loss of a future where we were connecting with people. Everything went virtual. Most of us were engaging in some forms of social isolation. And then that knocked out like everything, right? Like I
Yes.
tragic stories of people being like either a funeral couldn't happen or they had to like attend a funeral over Zoom or babies being born. My son was born in April 2020 and he was my second. So I'd had the experience of my daughter, and it was so wild to be like, nobody is bringing us meals. Nobody is meeting him. Nobody is connecting. I have this amazing kid that I love, and I can't engage with the world with him. And so I think that's what COVID really and of course it knocked out work systems and the way we work and how things operated, and so there was just like this, if you want to talk about like the pedal on the pond causing a ripple, I feel like this was the tsunami. Like there was a huge
Yes.
earthquake disruption, but it hit our social centers, but that is like our entire way of life prior to COVID, right? And what I saw that was different about that, which I think you're highlighting versus losing somebody we loved, is the response was like, well, let's just double down and work harder. Let's just see if we can't find our way for this to
Yes.
not be our reality or not to bother us. And so everyone doubled down and worked even harder. And I think that's why, 5 years later, you're seeing so much burnout in the workplace, every industry. I don't think I've been, and you probably have seen this in the work that you do, where the
Yes.
burnout is so high. And I think the burnout is so high because we just doubled down rather than processing, which was a survival technique. And made sense because it was like we didn't know how long that would last. But then nobody really was acknowledging that there was real loss there and that they were grieving all these things. And if you ask anyone, like, what did you lose during COVID? Most people have like a laundry list of things. And sometimes they're really positive life events that happened that they couldn't share, or really negative life events that they had to walk through without that support structure. So yeah, I think that's how I would say is we kind of lost our social structures.
Yeah. There's so in season one, I interviewed Reverend James Kress, and we talked about grief. And in his case, he had been going through a divorce, his second divorce. He had lost his mother. He had lost a lot of community. And he had an interesting way of putting it that has stayed with me, that's coming up for me now, where he talks about the holy work of grief being
Mm,
to move us through disorientation.
mm,
And this idea of disorientation is what's coming up when we talk about COVID. And this idea of doubling down, we turn to the tools we have and that we think will work because that's how we're wired. But that the disorientation of grief is such that we learn that the things that used to work don't in this context. There's something so
mm.
unique about the sorrow and disruption and disorientation that comes with grief that when nothing works, we're really left with ourselves. What comes up for you when you hear it in that way?
I really love that. I think it captures grief so well, of any grief, right? Because when you lose somebody, it's so your whole world is completely shaken upside down. And this is why grief, people always say like grief hits you out of nowhere, or like a sudden trigger will happen. Like you pass by maybe a cafe you used to eat out with that person and you're like, oh, why am I now I'm
Yep.
crying? Um, because it's so disorienting to be walking through life without that person who was so integrally woven into it. But I think the same with COVID. Like, I mean, I was just at a work event last week and we were all in person. And this was in New York where I lived before moving to Seattle. And I was like, oh, I miss the good old days of where like we would come into the office and we'd brainstorm and we'd collaborate and we'd do all these things. And they were like, yeah, that doesn't exist anymore. And so it was really interesting to see like the version of my job, of the city I lived in, all the things I did, like it doesn't exist anymore. And I think we moved way too quickly into the trying to problem solve the disorientation and for COVID, and we didn't grieve how disoriented we all were, you
Yeah.
know. So I really love that description.
Yeah, it's a rich episode, and it's one I'll link to this to have these two different sort of wraparounds for this idea of grief. Um, so what makes this such important work right now? And I'll say that I can feel and I trust my body to tell me things like this. I know that grief matters deeply. It is everywhere. In my experience, we don't do it well. Whether that is about, the death of a loved one. I feel like this whole idea of, we work through logistics. We have a funeral or a memorial service. Everybody brings pie, and then everyone goes back to work, right?
Mhm.
And it just strikes me as messed up.
Yeah.
Tell me about what is it about grief that is so up right now that this is such a timely topic? Like, why this and why now?
Yeah. I think why now is because I feel like collectively as a species, like humans are really hitting a tipping point of burning out on things being hard, of losing a lot of things. Just like dominoes, it feels like we had COVID, which created global disruption in the way we work, the way we live, the way childcare works, the way elder care works, right? There was just all these systems affected. And then after that, it's just been, thing after thing, multiple global wars, a lot of upheaval within our own systems here, a lot, just so much disruption of the way that we live our lives, of the things we're having to bear witness to. We see so much suffering just day to day. And so I think all of it's just hitting this breaking point where people are kind of finally admitting, like, I'm not doing well, you know? And I think that is like this global experience of grief that we haven't seen in the past. Because, like, if you lose somebody, people always talk about that when they lose somebody close to them, their whole world is imploding. Everything stops for them. And a frustrating part of that is everyone else's world kind of keeps propelling forward. And I think now is a time where, like, a lot of our worlds are stopping in some form or fashion. Unemployment rates are high. Like there's just so many, you could kind of pick any area of our world and you're just seeing extreme loss in all of those. And so there's just such a collective experience, I think, of loss. And so I think that's why this topic is becoming of more interest to people, and why I feel more of an urgency to talk about it.
I think about anyone who lives on the West Coast is what I can speak for, and even seeing the homeless population.
Yeah.
To walk around unaffected
Mhm.
would be very, very difficult. And if we can walk around unaffected, then we're tapping into a different set of coping skills,
Right.
probably. So tell me about your lens on this. You are a social psychologist. Let's actually back up for a second, talk about what is that?
Right. So,
Yeah.
a social psychologist, I know when I was first picking grad schools, I'm like, what are my options and what does that mean? So, social psychologist essentially is a field that is interested in understanding how our social relationships and our environments influence our attitudes and our behaviors. So, it's a pretty broad field that looks at everything from why do we feel compassion and empathy? How do we cope with challenges and struggles? How do we build resilience, right? That's a pretty broad field that's really trying to understand how we're operating as humans and then how our environments are affecting us.
And then, so what does research look like in this context?
So it's also pretty wide reaching, everything from, basic lab studies that are so interesting. One of my favorite studies showed that they had tested if you handed somebody a warm cup of coffee or a cup of iced coffee, how would they then rate you as a person? And they rated the person with the warm cup of coffee as much more warm and friendly, and the person with the cold cup of coffee is more cold and distant. So that would be like a very specific lab-based study,
Whoa.
all the way to like these broader national surveys or global surveys that are trying to look at how our personalities influence our attitudes towards different endorsements of maybe um, things that we would say that we do endorse or we don't endorse, or so there's quite a range within social psychology. um, and the way I apply it to the work that I do is I think a lot about how we think about patients who all live within some kind of a social structure, whether that is their families, their communities, their loved ones, but we don't often take that to account in how we're delivering healthcare, how we're supporting them and coming around them. And so that's where sort of the social psych piece of what I do comes in.
Okay. So then when you're doing research, do you tend to do it? I'm trying to get at what I'm asking here. Is it more one-on-one interpersonal, or is it like collective shared where you're doing more focus group, more community kind of study, or is it both?
It is both. I would say the
Okay.
majority of the field is very focused on the individual, but then that individual within the context of small social structures and larger social structures. So everything from the level of like just your family to your community, the city that you live in, to your country, to a more global, or some social psychologists are really interested in how an individual operates within an organization. So it can be from the smallest kind of social infrastructure to the
Got it.
larger ones. Mhm.
Okay. That's helpful. So that brings me around fully to us talking about this podcast and this topic. The thing that I want to be talking about is loving ourselves back into life, back into our lives. And that implies we're loving ourselves back from something else. I'm interested in the things that disrupt our connection to our vitality, our courage, our creativity, our joy, our sense of belonging. And grief is one of those that really, I think, disrupts, disorients, and shakes up that intimacy and that connection with life as it was. What comes up for you when I talk about this idea of loving ourselves back into life?
I think to me, that's like the point and the pathway of grief. Because I think grief is almost a process of acknowledging a loss and sort of allowing yourself to then move through that loss. And this is why a lot of times people say that grief never fully leaves. And it can be years since a loss, and you may still feel those things coming up. But I think grief and processing grief, A, allows us to acknowledge, like, I really did lose something there. And it's often a measure of how much love we had in that person, in that thing, in that relationship, whatever was lost. Grief is only experienced as a direct correlate of how much love we had. And so I feel like grieving is the process where you sort of love yourself back to your life because you're creating space to say, something was really lost here, and I'm really sad about that. And then you begin the process of processing that emotion. Whereas the alternative path is just completely ignoring it. And that to me is a real fast way to kind of kill your inner self, is to not give space to acknowledge the loss that you've had.
Yeah. In my work, I often see that people who have this kind of wisdom, it's because they've had a personal experience with it. What is
Yeah.
your heart story around this?
Yeah. It's so interesting. When I first started this work, I always thought, what is wrong with me? Because I had had no major losses to that point in time.
Yeah.
But I felt so deeply for people who had, and just a real calling to work on ways to help support those individuals. And it wasn't until between my daughter and my son, I had two miscarriages between the two of them. That was the first time I had experienced a loss that I would say just totally devastated me. And it was in moving through that I thought, well, first of all, I can see why a lot of things people say to people when they experience loss is so unhelpful. Um, but I think walking through that and really experiencing it really helped me connect more with the work that I do, because then I had more of a sense of what did it really feel like to have a hard time getting out the door every day, for little things here and there to be a total trigger of emotions and sorrow. And I think that continued to unfold in my life. A few years ago, I lost my father in law, which was another really big loss. And again, I think those intimate experiences of it has allowed me to then connect a little bit more. And even though my loss is really different than maybe a patient I'm working with loss or a friend I'm trying to come alongside, I think there's something about loss, and particularly losing a person that you love, that just kind of it brings you to a space of being a more empathic person. I think you can't help but feel more. People who have experienced loss described as this really interesting process where you're so devastated by the loss, and yet you kind of come through it feeling like you have so much more love for life, because I think it really drives home the point of the fragility of life. And ultimately, that none of us are in control of a lot of the things that we have.
Right.
And that I think drives a lot more empathy. And I think that's how I've seen it integrate into the work that I do.
So let me push on that because I'm curious. I think about, I shared with you, um, I lost my dad when I was 19 and he had a long battle with cancer. My brother
Mhm.
was younger. He was so 15 while he was terminal, 16 when he passed. I was 18 and then 19.
Wow.
And looking back, I would say he and I had very different responses, very different experiences of grief. You would have thought we lived in two different households, and also how it has shaped us coming out the other side as he and I now are both in our 50s. This was a long time ago. It's so interesting you were talking about the random triggers. It's 35 years ago that I lost my dad, and said my last goodbye. And this year, for some reason, his birthday was hard.
Mhm.
And many birthdays combined him just like, hey, dad, peace out, and I bow to it. I acknowledge it. Some years I forget, frankly, and I don't catch it till 2 days later. And I don't make myself wrong in any way about that. And then sometimes it zaps me. But for me, it was very much sorrow. From my brother, it was a lot of anger. It's his story, so I don't want to share too much about it. But, there was conviction about what he must accomplish in this lifetime. So for him, it
Mm.
really lit a fire of some sort. And I'll share even another woman I spoke to on my podcast, Val Liskey, talked about she's lost two brothers.
Mm.
And when her first brother died, she was younger, she was in her 30s. And she said, life is short. I have to get as much done as I can possibly get done. And she dropped into productivity and she started cruising. And as she put it, I got so much shit done. Like that's the direct quote, right? She's like, I'm never going to stop and read a book again because why would you do that? She said years later when her second brother died, what came for her was life is too short. I need to slow down.
Um,
If I'm not making it to my nephew's hockey game, what am I doing?
uh,
And so I think about these two separate examples, two siblings in the same household or the same person at different times. What is it that informs our grief in your understanding, our response to grief, not the grief itself, but
yeah.
what it does to and through us?
Yeah. No, I love the examples you shared because, if you ever talk about the stages of grief work that came out many decades ago, but a common misconception is that it's a linear walk through those steps. In reality, some people hit all the steps. This is where there's anger, there's denial, there's eventually moving into acceptance. Some people oscillate. They'll move forward, they'll move backward, they'll move forward, they'll move backward. But it's not linear and it's not the same for everyone. I think in my work, what I have seen is that number one, anger is probably one of the most common responses to loss. And I think that makes sense to feel that emotion. In many ways, anger is sometimes a safer emotion to feel than sadness. And so a lot of people will absolutely experience anger in response to a loss. I think it's interesting to think about what giving space to whatever emotion arises does for us. And so I think any whether that's deep sorrow and sadness, anger, whatever people are feeling, I think the key is to really feel that emotion and allow it to work itself through us, because I think what causes those difference is probably like where we're at in our life, our own orientation to mortality. Because for many people, that reality check of, oh my gosh, my life is short, it can trigger this desire to be like, and I better make it worth it. Whereas for many people, it's the complete opposite. It's, I better start savoring every moment. And I think what predicts that varies so differently from individual to individual. In the work that I do, I often find logistical restraints is what drives those differences. So a lot of the cancer patients I work with, they can't double down. Like that's their first reaction is to be like, oh my gosh, I better write the book that I never wrote. I'm writing it right now. But then treatments kick in and they are fatigued and they are nauseous and they have all these symptoms. And so life sort of forces them into a slower pace. And that's when they enter the zone of like, maybe I should just enjoy a really nice drink at the end of the day, or maybe I should really lean into this hug with my child, or whatever those savoring moments are. And so it's interesting. The guest you mentioned said her first experience was the double down, and I'd be willing to bet she was younger.
Yep.
There was a longer timeline, probably a lot more energy and bandwidth.
Yes.
And the second, you have had a loss to learn from, but you might be hitting a point at life where you realize maybe I don't. My husband once put it this way: you hit a point in life where you suddenly realize maybe I'm not going to accomplish all the things I want to. So then what then can I do? And
Yeah.
so I think that that often explains to people's varying reactions. But I think the takeaway is that all of it is valid, all of it is good, and the best thing we can do is give air and space to like invite whatever emotions. I think of the movie Inside Out. I don't know if you've seen that. It's Pixar's
Yes.
movie about the
Everybody should
different
see it.
emotions. It's so, I'm like, it's the best way to describe. They actually worked with a social psychologist for that
Oh,
film,
interesting.
who's an
Because
expert
of
in
course.
emotions, because of course we
Yeah.
do everything. Um, but I love that because the whole premise is that there's sort of a preconceived notion that joy is like the best emotion, and you start to see the value of anger, of disgust, of sadness, of these emotions we tend to avoid more. And they each have their little part to play. And I just love that narrative because I think it's the same with grief. Anger is a threatening emotion. We don't like being around it. We don't like feeling. It's a hot emotion, but it's a really valid emotion. And it tells us a lot in the same way that sadness has its own purpose too.
I really hope that the listener, and this is what I'm taking away, there's no one right way,
Right.
that wherever we are and whatever comes up is okay. There is a grief that moves through us and activates what is real for us. And that's what is ours to meet. And I hear you saying that so clearly. And it just feels very space giving. So then what do you say, or how do we talk to people who are looking to support people who are in grief? And we talked about this a little bit. This is one of the things I remember is people said the craziest stuff to me. And
Yeah.
even at 19, I was so aware this is the best they could do.
Yeah.
But when we're in the grief, I've had other, I would say, smaller griefs, smaller deaths, smaller losses, where I was like, are you really? That's what you're leading with today? And maybe they didn't understand or appreciate that it was grief. It was this like, okay, buck it up. What are you going to do? How do we guide people who are walking alongside or trying to walk alongside? The one thing that is consistent for me, say something, let it be clumsy, but say something, just don't ignore it with the people that we
Yeah.
care about and are close to. What would you say?
Yeah. I think the couple of tips I would give is I also am in the camp of say something. It might be clumsy and they might get really mad at you.
Yeah.
Um, and that's okay
Mhm.
because what I hear from the many patients I work with is the most hurtful thing is when people say absolutely nothing. Silence, I think, is a really powerfully and uniquely negative experience for somebody going through any kind of loss. Um, but the other two things I would say is number one, always lead with love. You know, if you bake, let's say you home bake cookies and you drop them off in love, because that's what you do, you bake, and the person has a gluten allergy, right?
Yep.
They're probably going to receive it as love and know
Yep.
that you didn't know. And so I think we worry so much about getting it wrong that we forget to lean into like, how am I good at loving people? Something I always do. It took me a while to realize this is I tend to try to bring humor into situations when people, where there's like a real heavy air, I'll crack a joke. I remember being at, it was actually funeral of a dear friend. They had lost their baby just a couple days before he was due. It was devastating. And she's weeping and everyone is coming up to her. And I wanted to have the most profound, perfect thing to say, and I didn't. And so I cracked a joke, obviously not about the death, but something else to make her smile. And I thought, why did I do that? And my husband was like, maybe she needed to laugh. Like maybe she was sick of crying. And I think thinking about the ways we can lean in with love, even if we miss the mark, a lot of times people feel the genuineness of that. And the second thing I say is like, don't take it personally. I do, when the reaction is poor, I do a lot of training with providers, physicians, and nurses on things like how to talk about death and how to talk about these challenging topics. And one of the things I do is how to respond to patient and family anger. And the biggest tip we give them is like, of course they're angry. They have cancer, or their
Yep.
cancer progressed, or they're finding out that they're going to die from their cancer. And so to know that that response of anger probably is going to be there irregardless of what you say, but that the love that you're doing things in is received normally somehow, even if it's underneath some prickly, prickly
Right.
49 situation.
Yeah.
And so those are the two tips I give to people to walking alongside is like, don't be so afraid of getting it wrong that you do nothing. And don't take it too personally if they're prickly about it.
Yeah. So that is great advice and bloody hard to do.
Yeah. So
Speaking
hard.
for a lot of
Yeah.
people. And I think the level, so acknowledging care for the caregivers.
Mm,
And so one thing that I would add is when we are supporting somebody in grief, to be sure we have a person. And when the village is working, we would
yeah.
all be able to do that and go, oh, I said this. I can't believe I said it was so stupid. She burst into tears, cried harder, and stormed out of the room. And so instead of me ruminating on that, being able to go to somebody to go, well, of course she did. She just lost her husband. Of course she did. She just lost her job. Um, Reminding us that not everybody wants to feel better right away, that is not the point, you know?
Yeah.
So this idea of us having people too who can remind us you're still okay, so this idea of not taking it personally. Um, what do you see? Because that can bring up a whole other grief if we're talking about grief and all the little deaths. Well, now my relationship feels compromised with somebody I'm trying to walk alongside of. And now I'm feeling that, oh, we used to be so close. I messed up so big, which you may or may not have. Like, it's not about that. It's about giving them space and acknowledging what we need as well. So, what do we do with that?
Yeah. No, I think what you outlined is so spot on, which is that being around grief is really hard and heavy to go be with a person who's experiencing deep loss. Um, whether that loss is, I lost my husband, I lost a child, or I lost my job and I'm looking at, I'm 12 months into unemployment. Whatever it is that we are around, we kind of enter that space of heaviness too. And so I think having people on our team who can reorient and remind us who we are and ground us in that reality is so smart. And, I think the answer to your question depends a lot on the nature of the relationship, where things go. In most cases, if it truly is a close connection, a deep relationship, um, it is capable of absorbing us coming back and saying, I really messed up. I did not mean to make you feel that way. I think, again, it's leading in love and just being a genuine person, and having some
Yeah.
transparency about the process. Because then what I often see is the person says, I know, I'm so sorry I freaked out on you. I was feeling X. Some people may not have that insight and might just be like, thank you for saying that. Or they
Yep.
may say nothing, right? But I think we can always circle back and say, I messed it up and this was my intention. And I think that's where consistency is really key because over time, as their loss, they're further out from the loss and the emotions are maybe a little less intense over time is where we start to see a little more of that relationship beginning to mend back up if we feel like there have been things said that, oh, I shouldn't have said that or I shouldn't have done that. I think being consistent and continuing to lean into love often sort of rectifies those mins and tears that we see in relationships. Now, obviously, if it's a less close relationship, that can totally vary and depend. But I think centering ourselves in being a loving person and trying to be that is like the singular best advice I've been given, and that I would say is key to walking through grief.
What is the journey from the grief where we lose ourselves in that disorientation and coming out the other side in a healthy relationship to ourselves and to life itself? What's that second part about?
And you're talking about like the process of moving from
Yes.
that point. I think it's such a frustrating answer, but it's time and space. I think it
Yeah, no, I
takes.
expected a magic pill because that would be great.
Actually, I'm
Dr.
selling
Megan.
them. I'm going to be very rich. I've got
Yes,
these pills.
I got you.
I
Perfect.
would I would sign up. Um, but no, I think it really is acknowledging the reality that it takes time, but it also takes space. Like I think it does take a processing of emotions. I think people who are sort of weathering the effects of COVID better than others are probably people who are taking a little bit of more of the time to say, like, geez, look at all the things I lost. Like, I want to create space for that. And I've seen people do some really amazing rituals to do this. I think you talked about we have funerals when we lose someone, but we don't have great rituals for any of the other losses. And I've seen people create a funeral for, their marriage if they get divorced, or and almost an entering into this new single life, or a job that was lost, maybe having some kind of a ceremony of that being gone, and then kind of clearing space for what's next. Because I think what grief does, one of the illustrations I've heard that I love, which is that grief is never gone. If you think about it like a tree, rings in a tree, all that happens is more life builds around the grief. And so eventually the grief, it's the same size it always was, but our lives kind of get bigger around it. And I think to have that level of integration requires allowing more life to build around it. And that's time, right? You can't make a tree grow faster. In the same way, I think grief is just something we have to give ourselves time. But I think that's one way to love ourselves really well, is to acknowledge that there has been a loss, whatever the loss is, and then saying, I'm going to have to give myself time to get over this thing. I think what we tend to do is to like carry on. And to your point, we do this even with people dying. I mean, work policies around returning to work after losing somebody are wild. It's like, all right, well, if it was a very close to loved one, you have 48 hours, which is unreasonable.
Yes.
But if you lose other things, it's like that doesn't even register as something you need to be processing. And so I think wherever we can carve out in our own lives space and time to process and to be patient with ourselves. I remember when I moved that was part of what my TEDx talk was about, was moving from New York to Seattle. And I just like really underestimated how big of a loss of community that would be for me. And it took me like a good, probably 1 or 2 years to finally admit to myself, like, you have to be patient with yourself, that it's going to take time to reintegrate, to rebuild a life, to kind of start this new chapter. And once I finally realized you can't expect to have your things all worked out and everything where it needs to be so
Yeah.
quickly, it almost gave me that breathing space. And that breathing space is what sort of allowed me to start having more of that, what you're talking about, that joy moments I could enjoy, because I wasn't putting so much pressure on myself to be, 10 miles down the road. I was okay being 50 feet down the road, which allowed me
Right.
to then kind of keep taking the steps and enjoying a little bit more of the process of the road as I built my life back up here.
Makes so much sense that you talk about time and space. We hear a lot, time heals all wounds, and I think it's a crock, you know? And I think actually you named part of what you just did is you helped me to understand why I feel that way, is that it's not just a function of time. Like that's an incomplete equation, but it's this idea of space, which operates separate and distinct from time, right? If we
Absolutely.
can have more space, it might take less time, which means it might take, 5 years, not 10 years, or 5 months, not 1 month, or 1 month, not 5 months. But without the space and, really acknowledging for anyone who's listening, This idea that we know life has to keep moving on, and there are ways to create pockets of space that might be of service. I appreciate so much you pointing to this idea of ritual and ceremony, which we're so short on in our world. And I'll say, I'm half Korean, half Irish Canadian. And the Korean side, when my grandmother passed away, um, it was my first exposure to Korean funeral. And the way that it went was so different than with my own father's funeral,
Mm.
is there were 3 days of services.
Oh,
And
wow.
each day, and it started with the family gathering with my grandmother, and it was the immediate family. And then we had the service, and the service was identical each of the 3 days, which was fascinating to me. I didn't know anything about this part of my own history, and I'm the firstborn outside of Korea in my mother's lineage. And so just to see how different it was that just by nature of giving 3 days to this process and to being together in a room, and different people cried at different times. Sometimes people were stoic through day 1 and sobbed through day 2. And by day 3, we're starting to move towards, okay, now we're going to break bread together. We're starting to move through something as a shared experience. And that was fascinating. Absolutely
So
fascinating.
beautiful.
It's a nicer way of being.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about I don't know if you've heard of Anderson Cooper's podcast on grief, All There Is. So in it, he
Yes.
interviews individuals who have lost somebody, but he talks about his own grief journey. The reason I was thinking time and space is he talks about losing his father at 10, and then he lost his brother 10 years later around 20. And he's like, and then I just sort of locked it all away for like decades, completely refused to deal with it, just kept it away, got really busy in his career as a journalist. And it's only now I think he's in his 50s, that he's like sitting down and intentionally processing through it. And it's beautiful if you get the chance to listen to the stories that he tells, but other people tell as well. But I think it's a real indicator of like, you can, I mean, it will absolutely impact you as an individual, but you can keep it in a closet, locked up, not dealt with. And so I think that's why the space piece is, to your point, so much time can pass. But if we just completely refuse to process or give space to our grief, it will stay, and it will stay heavy. Whereas when you begin to process it, I feel like that's when grief can metabolize into love a little bit more. And again, it never goes away, but it's through the processing that there's more of a feeling of gratitude and love that tends to emerge, versus to like keep it away where it's heavy and it
Yeah.
stays heavy. Um,
It's interesting. One of the measures of I'd say healing for me turned out to be when I could see my dad very clearly, which means, in the early stages, people only said good things. My dad was not a
mm,
perfect man. Like there's none of us are, and that's not any, he was a fabulous person. He was a caring and loving father and contributor in the world and all of those kinds of things, but he was not a perfect man. And when I realized one day that I could see his weaknesses or
mm,
the things, I remember him having a bout of anger one day. Or maybe it said something, stands out as sort of an isolated incident. And he ended up tossing something across the kitchen and yelling at me and storming off. And when I could see that through the eyes of love also, and see his
mm,
humanity, and it was no longer putting him on a pedestal to prove something. And I realized I'd been putting him on a pedestal or something. I don't even have the right language for it,
yeah,
sort of to prove that I was honoring him or honoring the loss. And this shift softened, it all just softened. I'm like, oh, yeah, I got an angry letter to write to you, Dad. And I did, you know,
I
and,
love that.
and it just got it out of my system. I was like, all right, onward, what's for lunch? Um,
Yeah,
so just acknowledging we heal so differently,
yeah.
and there are signs of life all around us. One thing we haven't talked about that I'm curious about your thoughts on is we talk about the burnout. But the other thing that I see is, and maybe this is part of burnout, but it also strikes me to be more something closer to grief or to locking it all away, is this idea of just the numbness.
Uh,
right? Where, I've really been fixated on this word hedonism that I came across a few months ago. This idea of being unable to feel delight, wonder, pleasure,
mhm.
and the lack of interest even in feeling it. Everyone's walking around numb going, why do I care? Why should I care? And so this numbness that I feel like leaves us walking around as kind of zombies or these hollow shells of ourselves in this human experience. What do you think that's about?
Yeah. I think that's tied to a lack of control. I think, you know, when we lose something or someone, a lot of times, if sadness isn't what we first enter, it's anger. But anger is a really exhausting emotion. So I'm thinking of like, we have so many failed systems from COVID, from what's going on, currently. And the first reaction when people don't like those changes is it can be anger, like, oh, like, okay. And then it might be some pushing back on it. But over time, if you still feel like you have no control over things, I think that's where you can enter this zone of, well, it's too tiring to stay in a state of caring. And so we can enter in the state of disengagement. And I think the strategy there is less about continuing to orient towards caring about the thing you can't change and to reorient to something you might have an ability to have maybe some level of control. So, for instance, the breaking point I see in the patients I work with is they all orient towards cure. I'm going to be cured. I'm going to be healed of this cancer. I'm going to be cured of this cancer. And for many of them, they do go on for that to be their story. What I'm most interested in is what happens when a patient realizes, oh my gosh, I I'm terminal. Like the treatments are not. I've tried all the treatments, I've tried trials, I've tried everything, and it's not working, and I am going to die from this cancer. That's a really hard place to be. And I think oftentimes the response to that is complete disengagement. But the ones I see that push through and say, okay, I am going to die from my cancer. What can I do that still brings me joy? I can still think about ways to have the limited time I have left with my family, or I can leave behind legacy for my children with these videos or these letters or these things I want to say, or I can volunteer with my community in the small ways I have left. Or for some of them, it is writing a book. They do something
Yeah,
incredible in their final months, but there's some way of reorienting. And I think that what's happening now is you are seeing a lot of just complete fatigue of lack of control over the things we care about. But where I'm seeing spaces of, and I'd be curious to see if you're seeing this too, is like these little points of reconnecting as communities at a very local level. This was a few months ago in the summer, but my neighborhood decided there was a park that was supposed to be in works for like years and just funding kept getting cut and things weren't happening. And so finally a few people just decided to locally organize and say, you know what, we're gonna plant tomato plants and fruits and all these things, and we're going to grow it together and we're going to take care of it together and we're going to donate the food to a food pantry and we're going to have a big event and we're going to like just grill out and bring everyone together. It was so beautiful. It was such a moment of hope. And I think it's because the people who organized it finally decided, all right, we're spinning our wheels out, hoping the systems will suddenly start working for us
right.
again.
Yeah,
What can I do? Where can I put my hands to work? What do I care about? And I think we're starting to see a little bit more of that where we're all just so apathetic and sort of feeling spun out, but sort of starting to say, this can't be where life ends. This can't be it, right? Just these lives that lack meaning or joy or hope. Okay, well then where could I reorient and find those? And I think it's those small places of community, families, neighborhoods. Um, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of what I think when you talk about that.
that's helpful. And it does answer it. And, that's what I see. And I'll say, even as a coach, so often going in, it is about the smallest thing. It is about, I start almost every session that I am at the front of the room in with feel your feet. Remember that you have
Mm,
them,
I love
right?
that. Yeah,
Like,
because we do.
we
Forget.
do. And we do forget. Feel it into your body. Like, let's plug into the fact we have a sensory relationship to our environment. Let's remember that we have one. Your body's here anyway. You might as well join it. So come on in. And I will see little sparks of life, in the eyes in the room, and I can feel it for me too. And, I will say, this is my little thing. I'm sitting here with a beautiful vase of peonies in front of me. It is brutal and gray right now in Seattle, where we both are. And these
Oh,
are
I
my,
love it. I love it.
and they make all the difference in the world. They make all the difference in the world to me. And they were a gift from one of my daughter's boyfriends. And so it's just this
Oh,
very sweet
I love
piece of
that.
something to connect to that's bigger than me, that reminds me life is blooming and moving through seasons and cycles. And I know they're temporary and they are going to pass. And that's okay. You know, what do you do when you start to feel really strung out? What's your way of finding yourself back to you?
My my practice is journaling. So I like to journal every morning. And it varies what I do, but I've actually recently gotten to the rhythm of there's a book by Sulika Jawad, who's a phenomenal author. I don't know if you probably I'm like, you're my people, you probably know about her.
Yes.
So she's just a phenomenal person, super talented artist, three-time cancer survivor, facing multiple rounds of leukemia treatment, and just wrote this beautiful book recently called The Book of Alchemy, which is all about how can we alchemize our pain into something good and joyful, and how can we do it in community. And when I first bought the book, I didn't fully know like the full structure of the book is literally
Me too.
100 days of read an essay, a short essay, and then there's a writing prompt. And I thought, okay, I'm game. I'll try it because I just love her work. And it's been transformative because the prompts are so interesting. They ask questions you don't think to ask yourself. I think my journaling tends to be like, okay, I'm going to process my emotions and think about my things. And what
Yeah.
I've loved it is it ranges from like think of a memory when you were a child that like is really vivid and makes you happy, or like how would you answer the question, how are you doing today, really? Or they're just like these really thoughtful questions. And I actually went through the first 100 days and I was like, all right, I'm going to do it again. And now I'm able to cross compare. I'll write for the day. And after I write, I'm like, what did I write on this day? Like this prompt, the first iteration.
So good.
And to see how I'm shocked because I'm like, well, that was only like 4 or 5 months ago. It's so different, and totally different things come to mind. Um, and so I think journaling centers me into joy and gratitude and presence. Um, I think that's one way I really like to enter that. I think walking is another, just like walking in nature is a real connecting point for me. It's just like silence, but beauty, whatever the season is, there's something there to just feel grateful for. So those are a couple
Yeah.
of my practices.
So good. Thank you for sharing those. Her book is rocking my world, I have to say. And one
I'm
of
so
my,
happy to hear.
yeah, I do. I bought it. I'm like, I have no idea, but I've seen her interviewed and I get it. And I was like, oh, I bit off a lot and
Yeah.
it's good. One
Yeah.
of my favorites was being invited to write about that embarrassing awkward, the big
Yes.
awkward.
Yes.
and
Yes.
and can you laugh about it yet? Or can you
Yeah.
not? And what's that about? And those are things we don't think about. And I know this is part of the reason why I love having this podcast is I think in questions. And the more powerful the inquiry, the more powerful our access to the human experience is my belief. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being here. I want to nod to the writing and bring that all the way back to your Substack newsletter, Light in the Wound. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this was something I started a few years ago, where I publish in various outlets, but I wanted a space to have like something I could show up to weekly. It was sort of a way to hold myself accountable and hopefully help people in the process. So the concept of light in the wound is based off a quote by Rumi, who's a poet that I love, which is that the wound is the place where the light enters you. And so the concept behind the newsletter and what I explore is sort of how do we find joy, love, resilience, peace? Like, how do we find the light in our wounded places? And so every week, I write something that's kind of in the vein of that.
I love it. So I'm going to encourage everybody, go and check that out. So that's on Substack. And, just for context, you are a woman who has written, you've been featured in Forbes, USA Today, Huffington Post, you've been interviewed on NPR and CBS News. This is your field of deep expertise. And I feel it as a place of your heart as well. And I bow to this idea that you bring your action and research together with your heart and your mind in service of this work. It's a big deal. Thank you.